This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 43 of Here's How. Britain is in disarray in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, but what about Ireland? Have any politicians got a clear plan for the new reality? In this podcast, I'll talk to a political correspondent with his ear to the ground.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have the political correspondent from TodayFM, Gavan Reilly. Gavan, you've been talking to lots of politicians behind the scenes after the Brexit vote, and we know that a lot of politicians didn't have much of a plan for what would happen in the UK if the Brexit vote went through as it did. This is one thing that was said about the Leave campaigners' plan.
He told me this. I said to him, so where's the plan? Can we see the Brexit plan now? There is no plan. The Leave campaign don't have a post-Brexit plan. And he was pointing over there to where the Vote Leave HQ was. And then he pointed over there and he said, number 10 should have had a plan. Now, it sounds like I'm making that up. That literally happened 2 hours ago.
And also we know what David Cameron's plan was if the Brexit vote went through. We had David exited. What plans do Irish politicians have? Or are you aware that Irish politicians were thinking through and gaming through what would happen if that vote happened as it did?
I don't think they had it really gamed through to its conclusion. Certainly there were some contingency plans drawn up, and even on the day of the result being announced, we did have something of an 8-page kind of a contingency document published with the general, the general signposts of where Ireland is going to go, and indeed some of it is quite heartless, quite vulturistic actually, that they're immediately saying if there are companies that are trying now to flee London because they want to retain an EU gateway, that Ireland should be their first port of call and immediately sweep in and try and hoover up that business. By and large, though, I think aside from that, realistically, I think it's probably fair to say that there hasn't been that much of a plan, but I think that's because Ireland, certainly in relation to its foreign policy at the least, is usually quite reactive rather than proactive. And so Ireland would have been really expecting the UK to come to the European table and say, OK, this is what we want. And that really, I think the position of the Irish politicians is that they can only really decide on how they're going to plan ahead when the UK puts a proposition on the table. And before that, there isn't really a huge amount that they can do to prepare in the meantime.
There is one thing about that, because this Article 50, apparently the way that it works is that once it is triggered, there's 2 years to negotiate an exit, but that's very much an exit. It's just how they disengage from the EU, not what happens afterwards. But once Article 50 is triggered, leaving the EU is certain. And I was saying in the last podcast that that's a little bit like jumping off a cliff and then starting the negotiations for the price of the trampoline at the bottom of the cliff as you're falling down. That's a difficult position for the British, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a little bit, or another analogy would be that you're jumping out of the plane and then immediately trying to call back someone and say, can you send down a parachute behind me, please? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's entirely understandable that David Cameron and Theresa May have both said, and I think Enda Kenny is on the same page as them of this, that there's no point in immediately rushing to trigger Article 50 because, as you say, as soon as it's triggered, that means the clock is ticking and that exit is a certainty, and that if you were to, trigger it, let's say on Halloween, for argument's sake, then on October the 31st, 2018, the UK would leave. And the whole point about these 2 years of talks in the meantime with the European Council is that they are meant to negotiate the landscape for afterwards. So you would only have those 2 years to say what kind of trade deal are you going to have, what kind of access to movement do you have. And obviously the access of movement is what determines how hard a border will be between Dundalk and Newry, for example. So I think it's entirely understandable that Ireland would be backing Britain in terms of, well, let's hold off, let's buy a little bit of time, because if we can get some softly negotiations underway first before Article 50 is invoked and before the clock starts ticking, then maybe we have a little bit more time on our hands. Now, obviously, you can understand as well from the European point of view and from the position of Eurocrats who have this vision of ever closer Europe and who now see this as a major fly in the ointment, and they want Britain out of the way, so they want the clock to start ticking as soon as it's possible. I think
one thing that happened there, Gavin, was that Michael Gove, I think on the morning after, said, oh, well, we don't have to go about triggering Article 50 in any great rush. We can have informal negotiations before we do that. The French and the Germans were out like a shot saying, no, you won't, no talks at all until you've triggered it.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, I think Michael Gove went one step further and appeared to suggest that there were ways that you could get out of the European Union without having to go near Article 50 at all, that you could use some kind of provision which isn't explicitly laid down, and you can do it more in a softly, hush-hush manner. Now, that, of course, is actually illegal under international law, because under the Vienna Conventions around, a treaty about treaties, if there is an explicit exit mechanism written into the treaty, then that's the one you have to use. There's no other ad hoc approach you can use after it. So Article 50 is the only way that it can be provided for under European law, that is, after all, in the Treaty of Lisbon, which the UK itself ratified in Parliament. So they are the rules of the game, but as we said, the clock starts ticking as soon as they press the button in Article 50. So I think it's entirely understandable, certainly from Enda Kenny's point of view, that he might like Britain to get its ducks in a row and to start about the softly approach, because if for example, and this is a bit hypothetical, but if it took let's say 3 years to have a proper discussion about what the border is going to look like, and if we can avoid hard checks, if that's the sort of chat that can be done in 3 years but can't be done in 2, then of course it's entirely in Ireland's interests to stall the ball and not have that button pushed straight away.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering more about the attitude of Irish politicians. Like, under their breaths, are they swearing and cursing David Cameron? Is there anybody in Leinster House who's kind of admiring him a bit?
Well, certainly in terms of the, I don't know if admiration is really the kind of word you can put for it, but certainly the TDs from the harder left side of the house, certainly the Anti-Austerity Alliance, People Before Profit, Independence for Change, they were all in fact backing Brexit, because they all think that the European project as a whole is fundamentally flawed, and that this idea of ever closer union is really just a way of saying neoliberalism by the back door, which is something that they abhor and that they don't want to go anywhere near. So you can entirely understand that point of view. Certainly I think from what people might call the more mainstream perspective, I think there's an awful lot of anger, because David Cameron was bounced into a referendum that he didn't particularly want to hold in the first place, and as a result of the events of that referendum, Ireland now finds itself really at a crossroads where there's going to be a tug of war at some point 3 or 5 years down the line, once Britain has left, where Ireland will find itself either being pulled in one direction out of the European Union by its nearest neighbour in terms of trade and freedom of movement and good neighbourly relations, and being pulled on the other arm back towards the centre of Europe, where all of our trade are, and where we ostensibly have a seat at a more important table. So there's a lot. How
valuable is that? How valuable is that seat? Because the Germans didn't show any sympathy whatsoever in the way that the banking collapse was dealt with, and we see in the last couple of days Angela Merkel essentially saying Ireland will get no special treatment despite the special difficulties that Brexit causes for Ireland. She doesn't exactly seem like she thinks she needs Ireland as a friend. We don't have her clearly as a friend. Do we need to adjust our view of that relationship?
We possibly do. I think you have to bear in mind that everything that happens at the European Council table, although people are looking at this with a grand European perspective, ultimately all politics is local, and that fundamentally a lot of the time, even though we're thinking about major international geopolitical issues, all the leaders at that table are thinking about domestic situations back home. But if you take Angela Merkel just as one example, she has the Eurosceptic Alternative for Deutschland, knocking on her back door with federal elections not too far down the line in Germany. So, while she might be inclined to perhaps go with the softly approach, and that maybe in other circumstances she would have said, well, let's cut a friendly deal with the UK, realistically she has to think about making an example of the UK to ward off the Eurosceptics back home. You have exactly the same in France, where Francois Hollande might like to be sympathetic towards the UK, but he can't because he's got Marine Le Pen trying to engineer a Frexit there as well. You have Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who might like to take the Netherlands out of the EU if he had a chance.
Sure. Looking at the French and the Germans, isn't it kind of convenient for them to say, oh, well, publicly we have to be seen to take a hard line, and then dropping hints that privately they might be more generous? That private generosity doesn't seem to come through very often.
No, it doesn't. But I think you have to bear in mind that no matter how positive a deal might be, it will always be interpreted or spun in certain ways by the Eurosceptics at home. So even if it was, let's say publicly they were doing that, where publicly they were saying absolutely no deal, and then privately they were saying, yeah, well, let's go softly. At some point, inherently, the private becomes public. So all you do then is stall for a couple of years, because if you have, let's say, again in Italy, the Movimento 5 Stelle, the Beppe Grillo's European protest movement, if you had Matteo Renzi at the European European table for 2 years saying we have to treat the UK with a hammer and tongs, and then it turns out that you finally get the treaty document for the UK's departure, and it still says open borders, free access to trade. And all it would do is add fuel to a fire that's been burning for 2 years. So I think what is public has to become private in this sort of situation. So they are always going to have to treat it with a little bit of hammer and tongs. And that, of course, to go back to your original question, is a fundamental difficulty for Ireland, because we may be the only people at the table who are fundamentally looking for the UK to be given a soft deal in our national political interest as well as in our national economic one.
One thing that was very notable in the first Scottish independence referendum
Indeed.
was that in Ireland, absolutely nobody said a word about it, and I'm sure there was some private word went round or some quiet conference, especially within Sinn Féin, where people were told to keep their mouths shut because nothing they could say would be constructive. And I think that happened probably on the unionist side as well. Will Ireland be quite so quiet if there's a second independence referendum in Scotland?
I wouldn't think it would be quite so quiet. I mean, I think there'll still obviously be the high-level diplomatic opinion of, well, this is an opinion for the Scottish voters and no one else. But obviously that was given, a lie was given to that when Ireland began to formally get involved in the British EU referendum itself. So we've kind of crossed that Rubicon now where we do openly take sides in these things, albeit perhaps not pushing that side very much. I did think it was very interesting that in the European Council following the British referendum, that on the Tuesday night, while David Cameron was still in the room, and bearing in mind the UK is still an EU member state, and David Cameron at the time represented England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, that while he was still at the table, Enda Kenny was already volunteering to speak on Scotland's behalf and to raise Scotland's concerns. And that to me was quite an interesting insight. And I suspect that what in fact we're actually doing is that, knowing that Britain is now on the path to exit, and Theresa May has said Brexit means Brexit, so we assume that now is going to bear fruit. If we get to a situation where there is a second Scottish independence referendum, I think Ireland is already laying the groundwork for, perhaps not even for Scotland to become a new member state, but I suspect what might actually be happening is that if there is a second referendum in Scotland, Scotland will not want to be a new member state, but rather I think it would like to replace the UK at the table. And that's quite interesting, because bear in mind
that it should become a successor state, a little bit like Russia became the successor state for the Soviet Union or the United Nations.
Precisely, yes, because bear in mind then that Scotland would inherit all of the UK's special clauses. It would inherit the farming rebate, but it would also inherit the automatic opt-out on justice matters because of the difference in the having the feudal legal system versus the civil system. It would also retain the right to opt into the euro, that it would retain the right to keep onto the pound, because any new member state to the EU has to ultimately declare the euro as one of the milestones they want to reach on that journey. So it's definitely in Scotland's interests to try and become the successor rather than a new replacement. But one other thing that I think is interesting, and this is something that a former diplomat explained to me before, and this was someone who hadn't sat at the EU table, but he had sat at the United Nations General Assembly behind the Ireland plaque. And he said that you'd be surprised to think it, but that sometimes international diplomacy on those high tables with the smoky rooms, sometimes they're a little bit almost like a high school cafeteria, where even though states might ostensibly have different interests, then when it comes to a global stage, they tend to club together. So in the European context, he imagined that you'd probably have a situation where the Mediterranean island states like Malta and Cyprus probably hang around together, probably generally tend to take the same outlook.
This sounds like voting at the Eurovision.
Yeah, a little bit. To be honest, yeah, that the Baltic states would take a similar outlook, the Balkans would, all the former Soviet states would, that obviously France and Germany tend to take the same outlook, the Iberian states, the Nordic states, and that it was probably the case that certainly in a gang of 28 that Ireland and the UK were always the BFFs over in the corner. And now Ireland has found that its best friend is moving to another school, and I suspect it would quite like if its Scottish cousins then decided to move back into the parish and to come along to school with it, because otherwise Ireland will find itself without its natural wingman, and that it might in fact make perfect sense for Ireland to lay the groundwork and try and argue the case for Scotland to become the successor straight away.
I'm struck by one thing in the EU, and it's the way that Irish politicians behave, because essentially up to the financial crisis, the way that Ireland behaved was basically sucking up to the larger member states and getting huge wads of cash in return for that. But then after the eastern states joined in 2005 and Ireland obviously was in deep economic trouble in 2008, isn't it the case that Ireland's interests have diverged from those of the larger states, and maybe we should be looking to to maybe small states like the Baltic states, because they're the type of countries who are really like us. They're on the edge and they're smaller.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're the ones who are still the net beneficiaries of the European project. And that, of course, was always the case with Ireland until 2005 when we had all of those accessions. And then, of course, up until the banking crisis, where to a sense we became net beneficiaries again, but of course they're only loans and we'll always have to pay them back. And I think you raise an interesting point that now that the UK is gone from the table, we are going to have to look further afield to try and strike up some natural affinities, and perhaps those newer accession states from the Baltic area, perhaps they might be the natural place, or perhaps we might look towards the Nordic areas because they're naturally, they speak quite good English, which I know is a very facetious thing to say, but that it can certainly help to try and get things evened out. It does present a little bit of an existential crisis for Ireland to look at and say, well, where are we going to strike up strategic alliances if there's not going to be anyone from the British island, whether it's the UK or Scotland or an independent Scotland or whatever else, who else is going to be there?
I want to move on to one other issue. Did you get a feeling, just talking to people around Leinster House, that there's maybe an element of Schadenfreude, that they're almost satisfied that the British political system is tearing itself to pieces?
A little bit. There was one mischievous theory, and I don't know whether to read into it, but there was one theory that went around, especially when Enda Kenny had spoken on Scotland's behalf while the UK was still at the table, that maybe perhaps this is the greatest act of revenge served cold, that maybe after 800 years of colonialism, that in fact Ireland's revenge will be to bring about the dissolution of the UK itself. I don't know whether we can read too much into that, but there is a little bit of a, well, they've made their own mess and now they can lie in it. But of course, I think it's always, no matter how temporary that kind of Schadenfreude might be, that ultimately there is that sense of, well, that's all well and good, but if we have a crisis on our doorstep, it's not too long before the fire might spread over here. And that generally, whether we might always have this colonial overhang of, well, good for them that they're falling apart. It is on a financial sense, and with everything so globalized and with trade so important for jobs and everything else now, there is a sense that any instability at all in the UK is a bad idea. And in a sense, we're probably lucky that we've just averted a situation where both the Tories and Labour were both going to have leadership contests and potentially then a snap general election to follow, because any situation where you have that much tumult, where the UK doesn't know whether even the centre can hold from within, let alone what its foreign policy is going to look like, is always going to have knock-on detrimental effects for Ireland. And I think there is a sense of relief, at least, that we've managed to avert that kind of double leadership heave at the same time.
Gavan Reilly, political correspondent for TodayFM, you win the prize for being the fastest speaker ever on the podcast. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
That's almost the end of episode 43 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 13th of July 2016. If you can think of a topic that you think should be covered in the next show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating, or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter @Here'sHowPodcast, follow Gavan Reilly on Twitter @GavReilly, and subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come onto your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. If you don't know how to do that, there's step-by-step instructions along with contact details at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.